Welcome to today's episode, where we'll be diving into one of the most defining conflicts of the 20th century, the Cold War. Lasting from the end of World War II in 1945 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Cold War was a period of intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their respective allies. This global struggle for power and influence wasn't fought on traditional battlefields but was marked by espionage, political maneuvering, nuclear arms races, and proxy wars. The Cold War shaped international relations, influenced global culture, and left a legacy that continues to impact the world today. What were the origins of this conflict? How did it unfold across different regions? And what were its lasting consequences? Join me as we explore the Cold War, its key events, and its enduring impact on our world. To understand the Cold War, we need to look back at the end of World War II, when the wartime alliance between the United States, the Soviet Union, and the other Allied powers began to unravel. The ideological differences between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union, became increasingly apparent as they disagreed over the post-war order. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 and the Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945 highlighted these tensions. At Yalta, the Allies agreed on the division of Germany and the establishment of spheres of influence in Europe, but there were underlying disagreements about the future of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union sought to establish a buffer zone of friendly, communist states to protect itself from future invasions, while the United States and Britain advocated for free elections and democratic governments in the region. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 by the United States not only hastened the end of World War II but also marked the beginning of the nuclear age. The possession of atomic weapons by the United States gave it a significant strategic advantage, which the Soviet Union was determined to match. This led to an arms race that would define much of the Cold War era. By 1947, the Cold War was in full swing. The Truman Doctrine, announced by U.S. President Harry Truman, signaled America's commitment to containing the spread of communism. This policy was further solidified by the Marshall Plan, which provided economic aid to help rebuild Western European economies, thereby preventing the spread of communism in the region. The Soviet Union, in response, tightened its control over Eastern Europe, establishing communist governments and forming the Eastern Bloc. The early years of the Cold War were characterized by the division of Europe into two hostile camps. In 1948, the Berlin blockade became one of the first major crises of the Cold War. The Soviet Union attempted to cut off all access to West Berlin, which was located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of East Germany. In response, the United States and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city with food and fuel by air for almost a year until the blockade was lifted in 1949. This event symbolized the growing divide between East and West and set the stage for the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, which would become the most iconic symbol of the Cold War. In 1949, two significant events further intensified the Cold War. The first was the successful detonation of the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb, ending the U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons and escalating the arms race. The second was the victory of the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong in the Chinese Civil War, leading to the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The spread of communism to Asia reinforced American fears of a global communist threat, leading to the adoption of the policy of containment in Asia as well. This policy was soon put to the test with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, prompting a United Nations response led by the United States. The war ended in a stalemate in 1953, with Korea remaining divided along the 38th parallel, a division that persists to this day. The Korean War was a clear example of a Cold War proxy war, where the superpowers supported opposing sides in regional conflicts without directly engaging each other militarily. The formation of military alliances further solidified the division of Europe and the world. In 1949, the United States and its Western allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as a collective defense against the Soviet threat. In response, the Soviet Union established the Warsaw Pact in 1955, a military alliance of communist states in Eastern Europe. These alliances created a bipolar world, with the United States and the Soviet Union leading opposing blocs. While Europe was the primary focus of Cold War tensions, the conflict quickly spread to other parts of the world, with both superpowers seeking to expand their influence in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The decolonization of Africa and Asia following World War II created new opportunities for the United States and the Soviet Union to compete for influence in these regions. In the Middle East, the Cold War played out in a series of coups, revolutions, and conflicts. The 1953 CIA-backed coup in Iran, which overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstated the Shah, was motivated by fears of Soviet influence in the region. The Suez Crisis of 1956, where Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, led to a brief conflict involving Britain, France, Israel, and Egypt, with the United States and the Soviet Union playing key roles in the resolution of the crisis. In Latin America, the Cold War had a profound impact, most notably in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 brought Fidel Castro to power, establishing a communist government just 90 miles from the United States. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, an attempt by the U.S. to overthrow Castro, further escalated tensions. The situation reached a peak during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to a tense standoff that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was eventually resolved through negotiations, with the Soviet Union agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. In Southeast Asia, the Cold War manifested in the Vietnam War, a prolonged and devastating conflict that lasted from 1955 to 1975. The United States, seeking to prevent the spread of communism in Asia, supported the government of South Vietnam against the Communist North, which was backed by the Soviet Union and China. The war ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975, leading to the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on American society, leading to widespread protests and a reassessment of U.S. foreign policy. Africa also became a battleground for Cold War influence, with the superpowers supporting opposing sides in various conflicts and independence movements. The Congo crisis in the 1960s, the Angolan Civil War in the 1970s, and the Ethiopian Civil War in the 1980s were all influenced by Cold War dynamics, as the United States and the Soviet Union sought to expand their influence on the continent. One of the most prominent aspects of the Cold War was the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, particularly the development and stockpiling of nuclear weapons. Both superpowers sought to achieve nuclear superiority, leading to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, where both sides possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other in the event of a conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted the dangers of this arms race, leading to efforts to control and reduce the number of nuclear weapons through treaties such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, in 1968 and the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, in the 1970s. In addition to the arms race, the Cold War also saw a competition for technological and ideological superiority in the form of the space race. The Soviet Union took an early lead with the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, followed by Yuri Gagarin becoming the first human in space in 1961. These achievements shocked the United States and led to increased investment in space exploration. In response, the United States accelerated its own space program, culminating in the Apollo 11 mission in 1969, where astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to set foot on the moon. The space race was not only a demonstration of technological prowess but also a key component of the ideological battle between capitalism and communism. While the arms race and space race were primarily driven by competition, they also led to significant advancements in science and technology that had lasting impacts beyond the Cold War. The development of missile technology, computers, and satellites were all accelerated by the competition between the superpowers, laying the groundwork for many of the technologies we rely on today. The late 1960s and 1970s saw a period of détente, or the easing of tensions, between the United States and the Soviet Union. This period was marked by a series of arms control agreements, including the SALT treaties, as well as increased diplomatic and economic exchanges. Détente was driven by a recognition on both sides that the arms race was unsustainable and that direct confrontation could lead to mutually assured destruction. However, the period of détente was short-lived. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 marked the end of détente and a return to Cold War tensions. The United States, under President Ronald Reagan, adopted a more aggressive stance towards the Soviet Union, increasing military spending and supporting anti-communist movements around the world. Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, also known as Star Wars, aimed to develop a missile defense system that could protect the United States from a Soviet nuclear attack, further escalating the arms race. Despite the renewed tensions, the 1980s also saw significant changes within the Soviet Union that would eventually lead to the end of the Cold War. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union implemented a series of reforms known as perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. These reforms aimed to address the economic stagnation and political corruption that had plagued the Soviet Union for decades. However, they also unleashed forces that would ultimately lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War in Europe. The wall, which had divided East and West Berlin since 1961, was torn down as the communist governments of Eastern Europe collapsed one by one. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated, bringing an end to the Cold War era. The Cold War left a profound legacy on the world, shaping international relations, political ideologies, and cultural developments for decades. The division of the world into two competing blocs led to the creation of alliances, institutions, and doctrines that continue to influence global politics today. The arms race and the proliferation of nuclear weapons during the Cold War have had lasting implications for global security. The concept of mutually assured destruction, while preventing direct conflict between the superpowers, also created a world where the threat of nuclear annihilation remains a constant concern. Efforts to control and reduce nuclear weapons continue to this day, as new challenges, such as nuclear proliferation and the risk of nuclear terrorism, emerge. The Cold War also had a significant impact on the development of technology and science. The competition between the United States and the Soviet Union spurred innovations in fields such as aerospace, computing, and telecommunications. Many of the technologies that define the modern world, from satellites to the internet, have their roots in Cold War-era research and development. Politically, the end of the Cold War led to the emergence of the United States as the world's sole superpower, but it also left a vacuum in regions that had been dominated by the Soviet Union. The collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union led to the spread of democracy and capitalism, but it also created new challenges, including ethnic conflicts, economic instability, and the rise of nationalist movements. The cultural impact of the Cold War is also significant. The conflict influenced literature, film, music, and art, as both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to promote their respective ideologies through cultural expression. The Cold War also left a lasting mark on popular culture, with the imagery of spies, nuclear war, and the struggle between East and West continuing to resonate in the collective imagination. The Cold War was a complex and multifaceted conflict that shaped the second half of the 20th century and continues to influence the world today. It was a struggle for power and influence that played out on a global scale, involving not just the superpowers but also countless other nations, movements, and individuals. The legacy of the Cold War is still evident in the geopolitical landscape, the technological advancements, and the cultural expressions of our time. As we look back on the Cold War, we are reminded of the dangers of ideological conflict and the importance of diplomacy, dialogue, and cooperation in addressing global challenges. The lessons of the Cold War are particularly relevant today as the world grapples with new forms of competition and conflict in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the Cold War. I hope this exploration has given you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in history and the ways in which it continues to shape our world today.